Welcome to this online event hosted by Agora Energiewende. My name is Nicola Bock. I'm head of events at Agora. And for the Korean audience amongst us, Bangap Subnida. I hope I pronounced it correctly. I did ask my Korean colleague this morning, and yes, it's always worth a try. Today, we present an ambitious net zero roadmap for South Korea, emissions reduction pathways, drivers, costs, and benefits. And why is that? Well, there are plans for climate neutrality in South Korea by 2050. And targets are great, obviously, and important. But in order to get there, a concrete implementation pathway is needed. And therefore, 3 leading Korean climate and energy think tanks, in partnership with Agora Energiewende, put their heads together to come up with such a roadmap. And the study, 2050 Climate Neutrality Roadmap for Korea, KMAP scenario, was published just an hour ago. You can find it on our website now, and my colleague Maxi will most probably put the link into the chat now, so you can find it there. And dear audience, you are amongst the first to get a presentation of the results of this study, which was just published this morning or afternoon time in Korea, morning time in Germany and Europe. And we have some of the authors on the panel here, and they will be giving 2 presentations. One first to present the results of the study, and then secondly, the implications of KMAP based on the Korean context. And after the 2 presentations, we will have ample time, hopefully, to go into a Q&A session and to address all the questions that you might have. Don't hesitate to put anything that comes across your mind into the Q&A box. We're looking forward to it. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Dimitri Pesha, who is the program lead of our Southeast Asia program at Agora Energiewende, and who will be moderating the webinar from now on. Microphone over to you, and I'm looking forward to the presentations and the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Nicola, and good morning to all the attendees from Europe. Good afternoon from the people in Korea and in Asia. I'm very glad to see that there is so many different nationalities interested in this work. We will present you today this project that has been our focus over the last almost a year, which is an ambitious climate neutrality roadmap for South Korea. And actually, the results have been already presented last week in Korea, in Korean for a specific Korean audience, and we are very glad to disseminate the results to a broader international audience today. And as Nicola said, this is the result of a very fruitful cooperation between Agora Energiewende and 3 leading Korean think tanks, the Green Energy Strategy Institute, the Institute for Green Transformation, and Next Group. The work has also benefited from a lot of consultation with German experts, and I take the opportunity to thank all of the colleagues in Seoul and in Germany who have been working hard on this project and who may be here today with us. So as Nicola highlighted, this project is all about investigating an ambitious roadmap for decarbonizing the Korean economy in every economic sectors. So in the power sectors, in the industry, in the buildings, in the transport, and in the agriculture. And the project also highlights political strategies which are required to accelerate this transformation. We gave this project a nickname, the Korean map or the key map. And it can be found indeed online, as my colleague has already put the link in the chat. I think this work is politically very timely for 2 reasons. The first one is that, as Nicola said, Korea has pledged to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And in the last COP in Glasgow, the Korean government, just a couple of days before, has also backed up this commitment with a plan. A governmental plan for 2050, and also a revision of its nationally determined contribution, the NDC, for 2030. So with our project, we hope to contribute to align this ambition level of the Korean government with concrete strategic implementation. And the roadmap that we have proposed is concrete, ambitious, is backed up with numbers in every sectors, and shows how to concretely achieve net zero in the next 3 decades. And we also critically assessed some of the political strategies and instruments that are pushed forward by the government in Korea. There is another reason why this webinar today is very timely. It's because in about 3 weeks from now, we have the presidential election coming in Korea. And there is a very interesting dynamism and a lot of uncertainty about who will be actually the leader of this election. And the energy policy, the direction could be quite different depending on who will be selected by the Korean people. So we hope with this study, we can actually provide a useful contribution to the next administration in Korea and help Korean policymakers to successfully navigate through the challenge ahead. So now we will have a presentation from Rachel Eun-ko, who is the director of Next Group, who will present the main results of the KIMAP project. And then we will have a presentation from my colleague Kwang Hee-yeom, who is senior associate at Agora Energiewende for South Korea. But before going into the presentation, just to be sure that you have a bit of familiarity with this Korean system, we have a small poll for you. And I will ask my colleague Kenzie to put it on the screen. We would like to know if you have any idea about what is today the level of emission, of CO2 emission in Korea in 2018. Is it 728, 686, or 625? Since we are going to speak a lot about decarbonization, it's probably good to have a shared understanding of where we start. We will let you answer this poll as you wish on the road, and you will probably get the answer also during the presentation. And now let me introduce you to the first presenter, Rachel Eun-ko, Director of Next Group Korea. Rachel, you can turn on your mic. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dimitri, for the wonderful introduction. First of all, let me share my screen. All right. Okay. Okay, hi, international viewers. I am Rachel Ko from Next Group. I'm here today on behalf of the consortium of 3 Korean think tanks, as Dimitri already mentioned. This is a great pleasure to speak about our study findings and share thoughts for Korea's net zero transition movements with German and Korean and global audience. Today, I'm gonna walk you through the 2050 climate neutrality roadmap for Korea, in alias KMAP, which is an alternative scenario to Korean government's carbon neutrality scenario. In the KMAP, we suggest a more ambitious reduction pathway than the government does, calling for increasing Korea's NDC at least by 4 percentage point. In addition, we define the drivers behind an expected cost and benefit for the KMAP implementation. And before we start, I have to get some understanding about the terminology that I am going to use. So Korea uses carbon neutrality as the same meaning as climate neutrality. So that the carbon that Korea talks about means greenhouse gases in this presentation. Okay. The Korean government announced its updated NDC in last November at COP26. The NDC target is 36% cut from the 2018 net emissions by 2030, which was a lot strengthened from the previous version. Although it was the most ambitious level that the Korean government ever announced, the Korean NDC is widely assessed insufficient by the international community. For example, Climate Action Tracker assessed that if Korean NDC is adopted worldwide, the global temperature will rise up to 4 degrees Celsius. Thus, the target is highly insufficient. And also, UNFCCC mentioned already that signatories' NDCs are not on track to meet Paris Agreement goals, calling for more different targets. The consortium is on the same page with the international assessment, so we wanted to provide an alternative target level through the KMAP. Additionally, we wanted to provide concrete reduction measures on the timeline for more realistic and tangible action plans taking place. Lastly, for more active discussion for implementation, we've done cost and benefit analysis for a wider discussion on budget. So let me talk about Korea first. South Korea is a small country in terms of territory and population. Its size is 1/3 of Germany, and population is just over 50 million. However, its economy is never small. Its GDP is the world's 12th, and its GDP per capita reaches nearly $30,000. But Korea's emissions in 2019 were 701 billion tons CO2. Oh, this is not the net emission, it's the total emissions, which ranks the 9th globally. Compared to its physical size, the Korean economy turns out to be quite carbon intensive. And decarbonization in Korea is never an easy task, considering the country's many constraints. First of all, Korea has a completely isolated grid. Korea is a peninsula, but due to separation with North Korea, South Korea is practically an island. There is little possibility of connecting the grid with neighboring countries like Japan, China, and Russia for political and security reasons. Therefore, the grid is vulnerable to intermittency compared to the European grid. Second, it has limited natural resources, especially carbon storage space. Korea has just 700 million tons CO2 equivalent of underground storage, which will just cover 1 year of emissions. It doesn't have oil or gas wells nearby neither. Therefore, CCS is not a strong option for Korea. And the economy is highly manufacturing oriented. 60% of GDP comes from energy-intensive manufacturing, such as steel, refining, petrochemical, and semiconductors. Therefore, the agenda of industrial decarbonization often faces a fierce resistance and concerns that decarbonization could weaken the country's industrial competitiveness. And there's still a weak consensus on carbon neutrality in society. Korea has been slightly away from climate-related disasters so far, so people in general do not fully understand how serious climate change can be to their lives. Still, a majority of people perceive carbon neutrality as an enormous bill. Therefore, politicians are slow in promoting climate actions in the fear of losing their votes. Overall, Korea is placed under a very challenging situation. Despite difficulties, there is a visible traction in climate neutrality movement in this government for the last 2 years. And we, the consortium, would like to push a little bit more harder this trend. KMAP is designed to convince policymakers and induce fruitful policy discussions. So it was important for us to stand on the same ground with the government. Therefore, the research team accepted the basic assumptions that the government scenario took, especially macroeconomic parameters such as population, GDP growth, and industrial structure. This means that the research team respects the government's economic forecast. To the extent of not undermining growth prospects, we explored a wide range of reduction levers by each sector, namely power, industry, transport, building, agriculture, and LULUCF. We looked at the best possible reduction potential of each sectoral energy-related emission, process emission, and agricultural emissions. with our proposed reduction levers. KMAP reduction pathway is the aggregates of sectoral emissions that are reduced to the most possible level on condition that the government stance for the Korean economy stands valid. Now, let us have a glimpse of KMAP emission pathway. KMAP cuts 40% of its emissions by 2030 compared to the level of 2018 net emissions and achieves net zero by 2050. The blue line stands for the government scenario and the pink line is the KMAP. KMAP achieves 1.6 billion tons CO2 of cumulative reductions throughout 2022 to 2050 compared to the government scenario. Now let us look more closely. Up until 2030, 40% of domestic reduction is possible, particularly led by the power sector without CCUS. Not relying on overseas reduction, and CCUS is one of differentiating points from the government scenario. KMAP team sees that overseas reduction is not a responsible way to act for climate because it gives excuses to us not transforming the domestic structure. That's why we exclude that option. And also the reason why we didn't rely on CCUS is that considering current level of carbon capture technology in Korea, it is highly unlikely that the technology is commercialized by 2030. During the initial period towards 2030, the power sector contributes nearly 60% of the entire reductions by rapidly increasing renewable generation. The renewable generation will reach 380 terawatt hour in 2030, which is double the amount of the government target. In industry, low carbon technologies that are to be commercialized before 2030 are adopted. One example is gas DRI for steel making and higher efficiency of F-gas scrubbers for semiconductor manufacturing. Also, annual 2% rate of green retrofits and rapid EV deployment will add traction. Decarbonization gathers pace, especially in industry sector. Various low carbon technologies become commercialized. For example, hydrogen DRI, green naphtha, and alternative supplementary cementitious materials. In addition to that, there is a fundamental change in energy demand throughout the entire economy, moving from fossil fuel to hydrogen and electricity. Coal power phases out in 2035, natural gas in 2045, being replaced by renewables and hydrogen. Industry uses hydrogen instead of gas to provide high temperature heat. Internal combustion engines are replaced by 100% EVs in 2050, and gas heating is replaced by heat pumps and district heating. And agriculture uses bioenergy from manure fermentation. So the economy becomes truly sustainable, and that kind of energy structure could maintain net zero emissions even beyond 2050. And this is how we depict 2050 in KMAP. Emissions from waste, agriculture, and industry are completely offset by LULUCF. Compared to the government scenario, which is on the right side, KMAP achieves carbon neutral transport and building, and KMAP emits less than half of industrial emissions without dependence on CCS, except for unavoidable emissions that are related to people's lives. KMAP keeps emissions minimized. So to make this happen, KMAP proposes 4 main strategies. First is rapid renewable energy deployment. An annual 15 to 20 gigawatt of renewable addition is needed to a point where renewable energy takes up 84% in 2050, compared to 4% in 2018. This is a very, very ambitious goal, but it's the most critical part of the K-map. The team analyzed that Korea's offshore wind potential is as high as solar potential, so 84% renewable energy is possible technically. In parallel, of course, storage should be installed along. The right-hand chart shows that how fast we must install batteries and hydrogen storage. And in 2050, the total installed capacity of this storage reaches up to 200 gigawatt. Second is active use of hydrogen. Hydrogen demand will be driven by industry sector that will use it as feedstocks for steel and chemicals, and as fuel for heat. Fuel cell EV and hydrogen turbines will require hydrogen as well. In 2050, 19 million tons of hydrogen will be needed. 37% of the demand will be covered by domestic hydrogen production, and the other 63% by imports. Offshore wind that is not connected to inland grid will be used to produce hydrogen from 2035, and as offshore wind expands, the hydrogen production increases. However, there's remaining 63%, and this has to be covered by imports. Strategy number 3, adding 10 million low carbon vehicles, such as EVs, on the road by 2030 is key in the transport sector. This is nearly 42% of the total number of cars, a big jump from a current 1% in 2018. In K-map, 10 million EVs are deployed by 2030, which is 3 million higher than the government aims for. And ICE, internal combustion engines, are banned from 2040. Considering the most updated global and domestic car makers' production plans, this 10 million target is not an idealistic stretch. Early transition to EVs is especially critical because it accelerates decarbonization of the refining sector. What we observe now in Korea is that refineries start to turn their eyes to low carbon business such as hydrogen and carbon capture. Decarbonizing road transport will accelerate this trend, and more investment will be funneled into these technologies. After all, this strategy will cut 80% of the emissions from the transport, and in 2050, the transport achieves carbon neutrality. Strategy number 4, fourth strategy is building energy efficiency and heating fuel change. To increase building energy efficiency, it is necessary to promote green retrofit at an annual 2% rate and applying zero energy building, ZEB in shorthand, standard for all new buildings. This will reduce total energy demand in the building sector by 44% in 2050, and only 8% of the total buildings will remain energy inefficient in 2050. Heating fuel change is another pillar for building sector carbon neutrality. In the K-map, new gas boilers are banned from 2025, and 3.6 million heat pumps are replacing existing gas boilers. In 2050, there's no fossil fuel used for heating, thus achieving carbon neutrality. Now it's time to talk about money, how much we have to pay for this implementation. Net zero transition in Korea doesn't come cheap, but we see it's doable. To ensure a complete implementation of K-map, 45 trillion Korean won is required additionally compared to BAU expenses, which is roughly equivalent of 45 billion US dollars. The BAU expenses here mean that the amount of expenses required to maintain an economy of current energy mix and economic structure without carbon neutrality policy. 45 trillion Korean won accounts for 2.5% of Korea's 2020 real GDP. And this amount is the sum of CAPEX and OPEX from each sector. And this is a total sum of the entire economy. It is up to policymakers to decide how much share of this investment will be borne by government or private investors or people. Then how much we expect to gain back? The benefit from the carbon reductions ranges from 50 to 110 trillion Korean won per annum, which is a lot greater than the expected investment. The benefit was calculated from multiplying NGFS carbon price by cumulative carbon reductions from KMAP compared to KBAU. In other words, this is social avoided cost from carbon reductions. In NGFS carbon cost projections, there are several scenarios by policy goals, and we chose below 2-degree scenario and net zero scenario for Korea. Like the left-hand chart indicates, there are 2 carbon cost series, and KMAP adopted both scenarios and analyzed that the benefit could be somewhere between 50 to 110 trillion Korean won. Suggested policy levers by KMAP are 2-pronged: regulations and supports. We believe that both regulations and supports can work together in a direction where best performers get supports and bad performers get penalties. We suggest reinforcing current KETS and zero energy building standards and green procurement policies, which are already in place. What we need is just a little bit of reinforcement in these existing mechanisms. And also, we suggest maintaining or heightening EV subsidies and expanding renewable energy tax breaks and creating new mechanism like carbon contract for difference, in short, CCFD. Like this chart indicates, through CCFD, the government pays to companies for additional production cost incurred from low carbon technology transition, and companies will pay back later as they earn profits from carbon contracts. This CCFD is a policy mechanism that our partner Agora Energiewende has long been studying and participating in a pilot in Germany. And we will be taking a look at the feasibility and applicability of CCFD in Korea in the next study. This is conclusion from KMAP. Korea can push its greenhouse gas target further, achieving an additional 1.6 billion ton CO2 of cumulative reductions by 2050. The new government has to set aside additional budget as much as 2.5% of GDP to implement carbon neutrality. Net zero transition will require a sizable investment, but has the potential for a greater social benefit. More specifically, renewable energy deployment is the foremost agenda of Korea's decarbonization journey. To facilitate energy transition to hydrogen, measures to bring down hydrogen costs are necessary. An early EV deployment is key to accelerate other sectors' decarbonization. With the result from the KMAP, The consortium will have outreach activities targeted to presidential election camps and next presidential transition committee, calling for more ambitious climate action and a separated budget for carbon neutrality. In parallel, we will develop sector-specific policy measures in the upcoming study to keep this momentum ongoing to the next administration. So this is all I have. Thank you very much for listening.
Rachel, thanks you so much for this very insightful presentation. And I think it was not only clear, but also very precise. And I think with a lot of thought for what are the challenges ahead, but also what are the solutions for decarbonizing the Korean economy. From my perspective, I was quite impressed with this message that you say with domestic efforts only and without CCUS. So as opposed to what the government is planning, this 40% target in 2030 can be achieved. And this would actually facilitate the transition to net zero in 2050. So these two things are actually connected. And I think also these four strategy pillars that you are bringing forward are quite important: renewable expansion, green hydrogen for the industry, green vehicles in the transport, and the very important decarbonization of the building sector with retrofit and stricter emission or consumption standards in the building fleet. Rachel, before going and moving to my colleague, Kwang Hee, I think we could have a quick look at the poll that we asked before the beginning of your presentation. You answered basically in your presentation. The answer correct, if I am not mistaken, was 686, and about more than half of the participants have actually guessed the right answer. So it seems we have already a well knowledgeable audience here. As a comparison, let's say Germany is emitting about 850 or 900. So it's a system which is emitting a bit less, but it is also a smaller system. So per inhabitants, of course, the CO2 emission is much higher actually in Korea than in other developing economies. But again, thanks, Rachel. We will come back to question in a minute for you. But at this stage, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Kwang Hee, who is Senior Associate at Agora Energiewende. And Kwang Hee will actually discuss the political implication of our proposed scenario for the Korean context. Kwang Hee is in charge of our Korean program, and I'm very happy to give him the floor now to have more of a political discussion around these key drivers and enablers of the transition. Kwang Hee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dimitri, for introduction. Let me share my screen. Can you see my slide? This is Kwang Hee, Senior Associate South Korea at Agora Energiewende. After almost 1 year-long preparation, I'm very pleased today to finally introduce the KMF scenario to international audiences, you guys. And then now I'd like to present implication of KMF scenario, especially in the Korean context. First implication would be that KMF shows clear strategies to overcome the carbon-intensive past dependency in Korea. Since the end of the Korean War in 1953, Korea has been increasing its energy consumption so far. Unfortunately, as you may already know, Korea is an energy resource poor country, which has to import all of oil, coal, natural gas, and even uranium for nuclear power plants. More than 90% of the primary energy should be imported. Excluding renewable energy potential, the country has only limited anthracite coal reserves, but negligible for energy supply. Accordingly, greenhouse gas emissions have been also increasing. Now, Korea is the 11th largest emitter in the globe in terms of the CO2 emissions per capita. Korea actually emits about 30% more than Germany. As a result, energy intensity to produce a unit of GDP in Korea is more or less double than other developed economies. In October 2020, the current Korean president announced its pledge to reach net zero by 2050. It will be, however, absolutely the biggest challenge in the country's history because the country has never experienced any reductions of not only greenhouse gas emissions, but also energy consumption as a whole so far. In contrary to Korean government, which still focuses on fossil fuels because of its perceived economic competitiveness, KMF scenario clearly presents strategies, Rachel has already presented, on how to change such a path dependency. Those strategies will pave the way to reset the path to greener road. Second implication is that KMF shows that current climate measures in place in Korea must be significantly accelerated in order to reach climate neutrality. Although Korea has almost a similar set of the climate protection measures than other countries, the effectiveness of climate policies is much lower than other advanced economies, such as here in Germany. In terms of the renewable energy promotion, since 2012, kind of the American-style renewables portfolio standard is the main support scheme to the developers, in which renewable energy price is set by an auction, but it does not guarantee investment stability. Some renewable project developers complain about their financial losses. Such instability makes a new trend to develop a larger scale solar and wind projects, let me say more than a dozen megawatts, but on cheaper but environmentally sensitive areas such as mountains, rice fields, or wetlands, which quite often lead to environmental damage problems. Finally, as of today, despite the supporting measures, public perception on renewable energy in Korea is significantly lower than in Germany, for instance. Since 2015, the emissions trade scheme is in place in Korea, but the problem is that it does not contribute to greenhouse gas emissions reduction. The carbon price is neither added into the carbon-intensive power generations nor industry sectors. As a result, the portion of the coal and LNG power is quite dominant, more than 60% in the power mix. Some industries enjoy profits to sell surplus carbon credit because the government already provides them with a larger amount of free allowances than their real emissions. In the building sector, the Korean government already announced its plan to promote zero energy buildings in early 2014, but mandatory for private buildings will be enforced in 2025. Thus, despite a very shorter building lifetime than in the European countries, meaning that relatively new buildings are allowed in Korea, the overall energy consumption in the sector has not decreased at all. In addition, due to the tendency to find a new business area in power sector, such as small modular reactors, CCUS, or blue hydrogen, renewables have not been given political predominance yet. The implication of KMF is quite clear. The failure of a reduction is not due to lack of measures, but the scale of implementation matters. It is quite often seen that climate measures were not fully implemented when other agendas such as concern of the electricity price increase or slowdown of the construction industry, such an agenda emerged. If the government sets the climate protection as the country's top priority, then the specific measures can be at last enforced in a full scale. The third implication is that KMF presents opportunities for the manufacturing-based and export-oriented Korean business in global competition. In the figure, you can easily find which technologies are required to reach the net zero: renewables, green hydrogen production and applications, clean vehicles, heat pumps, CCU for green naphtha production, etc. Interestingly, some of them are neither mature nor commercialized yet. After the government announced the net zero pledge, the Korean industry sees risks than opportunities even now. But the narrative should be changed. The road to carbon neutrality can definitely be a good opportunity for the Korean industry to position itself as a leader for carbon-free technologies, since the country has a good potential to develop knowledge-intensive high-tech industry. As a matter of fact, this is exactly the type of leadership that Korea is trying to gain in the batteries, electric vehicles, and hydrogen businesses, and so on. Let me conclude my presentation. Korea has just 2 years for climate action and finally green transition. As we already know, election is the biggest window of opportunity that enables societal and political change in our society. For instance, the legally binding minimum wage in Germany was enforced just in 2015, after this issue had emerged in the election campaign in 2013. Regarding climate action, before and after the German Constitutional Court decision in April last year, almost every German party promised stronger climate protection targets and measures. As a result of the election, the Traffic Light Coalition has announced in the end of the last year very ambitious targets, including 80% of renewable energy electricity in 2030 and earlier coal phase out. Renewable energy target is even more ambitious than Agora already suggested. In 3 weeks, the Korean presidential election will take place. Unfortunately, climate protection does not get major attention due to economic and social inequality issues. But all of the candidates please economic growth and job creations, but with different solutions. Interestingly, liberals highlight that the climate protection and energy transition for economic growth, while conservatives point out that the fourth industrial revolutions and advanced scientific technology development will create tremendous jobs for youth generations. But frankly saying, regardless the result of the election, the Korean society has only 2 years for strengthening climate actions. Given the current presidential system in Korea, which limits only 1 term of 5-year presidency, only in the first 2 years, President has a power strong enough to push his innovative promises. After 3rd year, it is seen that the power decreases too significantly to enforce new agenda. Paying attention to such condition, and also in addition to international climate actions, which are developing every day, an ambitious and concrete implementation of a net zero pathway is a very timely, important, and inevitable. As an active stakeholder of the energy transition dialogue in Korea, it is key for me to try to convince the new Korean government to accept some specific components of our climate proposal. But as a citizens, thinking of a future generation and sustainable development globally, we, and not only I, but we have to push even harder the new Korean government to fully commit and implement an ambitious net zero for Korea. That's my last word for whole audiences today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dimitri, I think we cannot hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, here we are. I was thinking a lot, Kwangi, for these insights, and I was also sharing with you that I am actually a very fan of Korea, and I'm always impressed by their economic development power and also their cultural influence in the world and specifically in Europe. But when it comes to climate policy, it seems that actually Korea is indeed lacking behind. And as Kwangi said, used to be also an important coal exporter towards other Southeast Asian countries. And Kwangi, I think, as you mentioned, the current election and new change in the presidential landscape in Korea is actually probably a major opportunity to really shift this path dependency on fossil fuels toward a clean future. I'm very excited to see what will be the outcome of the election and also to see which of the programs will then implement and shift potentially energy policies. And I hope in this context that our proposal and your proposal can be helpful for the next Korean government. So having said that, I suggest now to go to the Q&A session. We already have several questions which came to us. So I would suggest Rachel and Kwangi, you can both join me and switch on your camera here. I will start actually with a question bundle regarding renewable energy development. And there is actually two levels of this question. The first one is actually quite technical. It's a question from Johnny West in the chat to understand better how we put constraints on the assumptions, but also how we took into account technology development for the cost and the different input parameters regarding renewable in our model, but also political constraints such as not in my backyard constraints or other constraints. So this would be the first part of the question. If Rachel or Kwangi could answer that. And the second one has more to do with the level of ambition. In your roadmap, you show that by 2050, we need 500 gigawatts of wind and solar power, or even more in Korea. And today, if I look at the number correctly, there is only 5%. So the question is, how can we go from this very low number to such a high number? Is it really realistic? And what are the main obstacles which need to be bypassed in order to drive this development of renewables? So please, Rachel, maybe you could try to answer the first one, and maybe Kwangi or Rachel could ask the second one, answer the second one.
Sure. Nicola, could you activate me to turn on the camera? I'm somehow blocked from turning on my camera, so I cannot show my face.
I didn't do it on purpose. I'll try to figure it out, but maybe you can already. There we are.
No, it works. Thank you. Thank you, Dimitri. And thank you for the question, Johnny West. First of all, I think I should answer to the first part of the question. We have adopted many assumptions, and especially for efficiency of technology you mentioned. I believe this was meant by energy efficiency. So for the industry sector, we adopted 10% energy efficiency improvement from 2020 to 2050 because currently the energy efficiency level in industry in Korea is assessed and maximized. So we had interviews with Korean industrial stakeholders and the government policymakers, and we concluded that maybe 10% of energy efficiency in 30 years could be the best target that we could ever adopt. So it's 10% in industrial and energy efficiency. And for maybe the learning curve rate, I think this would be better answered by Yonghyun later on. We adopt a certain learning curve in new technologies like solar or batteries or wind, like offshore and onshore wind. So this was adopted by the power sector methodology. So Yonghyun be ready to answer to that question later on. And for the raw material cost, for the fossil fuel cost, we took the median price of last 10-year prices. So because fossil fuel price fluctuate all the time, so we couldn't, find the very, the average for the last 10 years. So we rather took the median value from the last 10 historical price of fossil fuels. And for the raw materials other than fossil fuels, we took the forecast by the Korean government or Korean economic research institutes. Yeah. And about NIMBYism and political constraints, well, that's a good question. This is really, really hard to address in such a quantitative analysis. We certainly acknowledge that there is an enormous problem with this NIMBYism and political constraints, but it was nearly impossible for us to adopt that into this quantitative modeling. So this was not considered in the study. Okay, then Yonghyun, maybe could you turn on your camera and answer to the learning curve of the renewable power? Can you do that, please?
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Yonghyun Song, the director of Next Group, and I'm in charge of power sector research in KMAX scenario. So I will answer the question. Learning rate of 20% for solar power and 10% for wind power is applied in our scenario. This figure is from the recently global trend. So, and the Korean have much potentials to reduce the cost of renewable energy. So we applied it.
Thank you very much for this answer. Maybe let me go back to the more political question on the level of ambition. So 500 gigawatts or 550 gigawatts in the next 30 years. Is it realistic for Korea, and how can we go there?
Sorry, Dimitri, I forgot to mention it. Yonghyun, please come again. So could you give answer to the question? Do you think that much of ambitious addition in renewable energy is possible in Korea?
Hi again. We are already aware that the renewable energy supply in our scenario is past. In my opinion, the increasing rate of our scenario is we have proposed the normative scenario. So in the other cost assumptions or the government help with additional government help, the more renewable potentials can be realized. But in 2030, our scenario will be the best result in this situation, I think.
Yes, thank you. So realistic but ambitious, and a series of reforms need to be done to promote land availability for renewable energy projects. I guess a support scheme which are attracting investors. So there is probably a lot of work to be done for the next administration to design a supportive framework to achieve such deployment rates. We have another couple of questions which are related to what, Kwanki, you mentioned as advanced scientific technologies from the conservative parties. And I would like to put this question in a broader context. I understand that your KeyMap project roadmap shows a very technology-driven through renewables kind of scenario, right? But I understand that in Korea, there is still an open discussion on the technology options. Specifically, I don't think the role of nuclear is so clear about which part it will take in the long run and in the transition. But same goes with technologies such as CCS or CCUS and even production of hydrogen, being it blue or green. So I would like to understand a little bit better from this political perspective. Kwang, if you could elaborate. When you speak about advanced scientific technologies, do you mean all these different technologies that I just mentioned? And could we expect that if the Conservative Party is winning the election, they will actually push maybe for more nuclear or CCUS or this kind of technology in the transition?
Yeah, thank you very much. And then first, what the conservative parties pointed out as the knowledge-based scientific special technologies are, for instance, the bioindustry, and the IT or space industry, and so on. But sometimes some guy mentioned that for instance, the advanced nuclear technology is one of the option. But I would say it's quite a broad sense of the new technologies. The conservative parties point out. And in terms of the nuclear power plants issue, and then so yeah, it's still the controversial issues under discussion. And then some days ago, so the public debate took place, and then the leading candidate of the Conservative Party ambitiously mentioned that he does not want to construct new nuclear power plants. Up to now, so I would say there is no consensus, even in the conservative parties, whether new nuclear power plants will be promoted or not.
Okay. I understand this is a very interesting and also very different from, let's say, the situation in Germany, where at least you have a simplified long-term vision because the technology option is much more closed. I guess this discussion will need to be addressed further in the Korean context. We have a question regarding the role of biomass, specifically in the context of industry decarbonization. Is this, first of all, something that you addressed in your roadmap, in your calculation? And also, to which extent can we rely on importing this biomass, for example, from other Southeast Asian countries? Is it a strategy that is pushed forward by the government? Maybe, Rachel, you could try to answer this one.
Sure. It's also a very great question. Thank you, Shukri. Well, biomass definitely counts in our model, but it does not take up more than 5%. The reason why is that there is no strong consensus on biomass in Korea right now, because currently wood pellets used in Korea are mostly from Southeast Asia, more than 97% of its total use. So it means that Korea relies heavily on imports of biomass, and it doesn't nurture its inside like forestry or biomass industry inside. There are, well, first of all, the reason why we cannot nurture our biomass industry is that we have limited natural resources. We don't have a plenty forestry or biomass potential like Southeast Asian countries do. So we rely on imports. But recently, many environmental groups and politicians are concerned about the negative impact that Korean companies could have on other Southeast Asian countries' forestry. So normally it is, well, due to lack of proper regulations or due to proper process, it is often observed that damages in forestry and wild, just chaotic destruction and, like palm trees or, like forestry, like is being observed by like us today. So many environmental groups in Korea are really concerned about this unintended but disastrous impact of rely on biomass imports. And we, as the consortium from the civil society, share this concern. And in this model, we kind of conditioned the biomass use only up to the domestic unused wood biomass. It means that the wood biomass that is left unused after the deforestation. So that's why we have just such a small share of biomass in the model. And what I believe is that currently the Korean government has no official opinion about this biomass investment outside the countries, but I believe there are many Korean big companies investing in Southeast Asian countries, but I don't know if I'm not really sure if they abide by environmental regulations or, like some sustainability standards in their deforestation practices. So yeah, this is why we had to limit the biomass use in our model. I hope this answered the question.
Hopefully it does. At least it does make a lot of sense to me. I may want to move to a bit of a different sector, which is actually related somehow to the biomass discussion, which is the industry sector decarbonization. In Europe, we still see a certain potential for biomass in industry decarbonization for heat production. You just explained that in Korea, this is a kind of a different situation, also for this question of import problematic. But I would like to understand how the industry in Korea is embracing this transition that you highlight. Because up to 2030, you say there is already a massive need to move to DRI with fossil gas, natural gas, and then after 2030 or 35 to move to hydrogen DRI. Is the Korean steel industry, for example, ready to move? Did it already start, or is it a bit lacking behind because we see international development in other countries?
I believe Korean steelmakers are exploring every measure that they could adopt to do this carbon neutrality. But well, I have to admit that the pace, the speed is a bit less, a bit less than the European or the American companies do. But definitely one of the biggest steelmaker in Korea, POSCO, is actually considering building a hydrogen DRI facility in Australia, and they plan to build electric arc furnace in Korea, so that they could create a global value chain, like producing DRI in Australia and then they process it in Korea. That's one option that they are now looking to. So it is not that they are not looking at low carbon technologies yet, but hydrogen is not produced domestically now yet. So they are looking for the ways that could economically produce the quality steel products. So that's one way they are looking at it. But in our scenario, we propose a gas DRI first, and then moving to hydrogen DRI after 2035. But it seems that there is no consideration about gas DRI yet, and we are figuring out why they're not considering it, because it seems like a great bridge solution for them. It means that they don't have to relocate their factories, like overseas. Still, we are figuring why they don't consider it. And if we have chances to talk with them, we are willing to promote our technology roadmap solutions proposed by the KMAP.
Very interesting, this globalization of the value chain of green steel, and this project in Australia. I was not aware of it. It's quite inspiring also to see that there is solution to externalize part of the value chain outside the country while still keeping an industrial competitiveness. And could you just elaborate as a follow-up question on this one about the hydrogen and the supply for the DRI in the long run? In your scenario, is it green? Is it produced nationally? Is it blue? And what are the strategies that the government of Korea is pursuing in this context?
We are only addressing green hydrogen as hydrogen. So blue hydrogen is not counted in our analysis. And there are a few reasons. Because blue hydrogen, for now, at this technological level in Korea, is impossible. We could confidently say that, because carbon capture technology is still in a mature stage. And we are very concerned that companies or governments just rush to blue hydrogen without studying many of its negative impacts, such as it could emit more emissions than natural gas, because when we counter in all the energy losses from transforming the energy. And at this technological level, we do not have devices that burn 100% hydrogen yet. It means that we have to combine natural gas and hydrogen at a certain ratio. It means that it still emits carbons. So overall, we in our analysis, blue hydrogen is not clean enough in this situation, and it could rather cause a lock-in effect. It means when we build blue hydrogen infrastructure, and then if green hydrogen becomes commercialized, that this facility could be a stranded asset. So we don't want that either, and we don't want we don't want that prevents people from moving from blue hydrogen to green hydrogen, because we have assets that are already built. So considering many aspects, we decided to just take green hydrogen in our analysis. And this is one differentiating point from the government scenario, because the Korean government scenario, they integrate blue hydrogen as a bridge hydrogen before the green hydrogen. So, but we completely excluded blue hydrogen in our analysis.
Okay, Rachel, thanks a lot. This is very clear. Let me just have a last question on the industry kind of decarbonization component. Maybe you or Kwang Hee could actually elaborate on this one. You know that Europe has implemented or decided to implement a carbon border adjustment mechanism, meaning that product which will be produced outside of Europe with a higher CO2 intensity will need to pay a tax at the border. I was wondering, because it's a politically very sensitive topic, how this is actually perceived in Korea. Is it perceived as a driver for change, or is it perceived as a trade measure to defavor production outside Europe? Basically, how politicians and industry are reacting?
I might have to answer, right? Kwang Hee, do you want to?
Then please go ahead, and that's all I will add some.
All right. Well, CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is definitely seen as a push for net zero transition, and also at the same time trade barriers or trade protection mechanisms. So those two perspectives exist together in Korea, especially in the industrial circle and the Ministry of Industry. However, what I observe is that it is slowly moving from trade barriers to some push for net zero transition. Because while EU CBAM is being discussed quite a few months, like over a year, so initially Korean companies took it as they didn't like it, of course. However, as EU leads the discussion on this carbon border mechanism, and sometimes the United States, like the Biden administration, mentions about imposing carbon border taxes. So now Korean industry thinks that this is a game changer. So this is a changing force, like the force that changes international trade. So people are that perception is now taking root. What I feel that's how I feel. So compared to the last year, compared to just 1 year ago, companies were changed a lot, and I think it's largely due to like international paradigm shifts in the trade.
Mm. Thanks a lot.
And UCBAM contributed to that changes.
Yes. Kwang, do you have something to add on this political perspective?
Yeah. So, to counteract against the CBAM, which will be enforced in a few years, then I would say that for Korean context, it would be not much impossible to handle about this, because as I already mentioned, in Korea, so we have the emission trading system, which was introduced in early 2015, although so it is not implemented fully as like the European ETS market. Once the government sets and implements ETS as in principle, and then Korean industry does not pay its the carbon price into the European regulation. Then so within the Korean domestic market, we can handle about this the environmental invisible trade barriers, I think.
Okay, I get it. Thanks a lot, Kwang-hee and Rachel. I see we have one question on the chat still on the question of the effort to decarbonize power and industry. You described the level of investment which is needed. You also described the benefits, but mostly from the perspective of CO2 savings, and then using the social cost of carbon, you came with the overall benefit for the Korean economy. The question is or did you also consider co-benefits like impact on job, GDP creation for new economic sectors, impact on air pollution, and so on?
About the job creation or GDP increase, we haven't included that part in our analysis. But what I want to highlight through this occasion is that this decarbonization effort in industry is for a long-term industrial competitiveness. Like I said in the previous answer, the international trade is changing, is rapidly changing. So now steel is not same steel anymore. There are clean steels and there are dirty steels. Well, this would go for the other products as well. So now as the trade is, in the trade, what is important is that do you have any quality good of low emissions? So this will be a new paradigm, and we are witnessing a rapid change, like globally. So I would say that even it seems that there will be a lot of burden on industry or the economy to decarbonize operations, but eventually it will add competitiveness, trade competitiveness in the international trade, because Korea has that kind of technologies and they are very export oriented. So they are very keen on learning like new trends and changing environmental standards. So if Korean companies act early, they could take over the market share in the race of clean products. So that's how I want to frame this question.
Which is, by the way, at least from my perspective in Europe, what's happening a bit in the battery development sectors and even in the electric vehicles, right? There is already this leadership on some key technologies, maybe not in the industry sector as a whole, but in some segments, Korea is already very much a world leader. Okay. I will have a last question because we didn't address at all these sectors. It's the building sector. And I think it is interesting maybe to have Rachel, or one of the experts of the consortium who could tell us. I was quite impressed. You see a development of heat pumps, but I have the impression the building structure in Korea is very different than the one in Germany typically, because you have larger building blocks with a lot of flats. Is it a challenge for the development of heat pumps to have lower surfaces to heat? And could you tell us what are the specificities, incentives then to develop this important switch from boilers to heat pumps in Korea?
I think my colleague Hyunji would answer to this question better. Hyunji, are you ready?
Okay, thank you for your question. And as you said, in Korea, the apartments takes more than 60% of the residential buildings. So we have a huge building, and in recent years, there are 80% apartments are constructed in the new residential buildings. So we thought the heat pumps could be applied for apartments because it is better to put heat pumps in apartments than the small detached houses. So we applied heat pumps, and also we considered district heating, focused on the new constructed apartments. And for the incentives, we don't have any incentives to installation of the heat pumps in these days. So I think the Korean government has have to make more incentives on the heat pumps or district heating rather than the other political incentives. So yeah, and maybe we could figure out what specific incentives need in the next phase of our studies. So we can answer that later on.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Hyunji. And I saw that you are proposing a ban on fossil fuel boilers quite in a short term. So it's typically one of these important policy measures to drive the transition. We are coming to the end of this Q&A session. I thank you all very much. I think it was a lot of different aspects that we could highlight. I think this key map is a very intense, constructive, and also I hope bring a lot of insights to be discussed with the next government in Korea. And I really hope that some of the ideas that you're bringing there can be picked up by the next administration on the road toward net zero. Thanks again a lot to the participants and to the speakers. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm looking forward to seeing you in further webinars. Please stay tuned in our different channels on the different work we are doing in Germany, but also internationally. And I hand over to my colleague, Nicola Bock, for the final words. Thanks to all.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, for moderating this highly interesting session, and to you, Rachel and Kwang Hee, for presenting